The war had ended 3 days ago, but no one had told the wind. It still screamed through the ruins, carrying the smell of ash and frozen mud. The snow came sideways, covering the broken helmets and burned-out trucks that lined the valley road. A convoy moved slowly along it. Republic soldiers in green coats, rifles slung low, boots crunching through a world that felt dead. Corporal James Harrow walked at the rear of the lead truck, his breath steaming in the pale dawn. He had seen enough to last 10 lifetimes. Cities turned to dust, fields littered with boys who'd never learned to shave. And now, at the war's end, the orders were clear. Sweep the last Axis camps, secure survivors, and bring them in. He didn't expect to find anyone alive. When they reached the compound, silence met them. A gate hung open, the sign above it blackened by fire. The barbed wire drooped, and inside were shacks barely standing. Wood splintered, roofs half collapsed. The smell hit them first, not of battle, but of slow death, hunger, desperation. Lieutenant Briggs gave the signal. Fan out. Check for movement. Harrow moved carefully between the shacks. A door creaked. Inside, a faint rustle, then a voice, hoarse, trembling. Bitte. Wasser. He froze. Then he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her hair, the color of dust and frost, hung in tangled ropes around her face. Her uniform, Axis gray, hung off her shoulders like a ghost's skin. She was sitting on the ground, knees drawn to her chest, a tin cup clutched in shaking hands. Her eyes, wide and hollow, looked up at him with disbelief. Easy, Harrow said, raising a hand. You're safe now. She didn't seem to understand, but something in his tone broke her silence. Her lips parted again. Water, please. He knelt, unhooked his canteen, and handed it to her. She took it like it was sacred. When the water touched her tongue, she gasped, tears filling her eyes. It wasn't just thirst. It was life coming back all at once. Behind him, 2 other soldiers appeared at the doorway. One whistled low. Damn, they're all women. There were 5 of them in total, hiding in the shadows of that shack. Axis nurses and clerks left behind when their unit fled. Starved, shivering, afraid to believe the war had really ended. Sergeant, Briggs called. We've got survivors. The order came quick. Bring them out, feed them, transport them back to the field camp for questioning. But as they helped the women to their feet, Harrow felt something twist inside him. They weren't the enemy anymore. They were just people who'd seen hell from the other side. The sun broke weakly through the clouds by midday. The women sat near a fire the Republic soldiers built in the courtyard, wrapped in blankets, eating slow spoonfuls of broth. The one Harrow had given water to sat closest to him. Her name, she said softly, was Elsa. Where were you stationed? Harrow asked gently. She hesitated, then looked toward the burned administrative building. Here, we took care of the wounded. When the bombing started, our officers left. The gates were locked. We couldn't leave. How long ago? She stared at the ground. 6 days. Maybe 7. We stopped counting. Harrow swallowed hard. He looked around the camp, at the frost-bitten bodies buried under snow, the half-eaten loaves of bread, the marks of desperate fingernails on the walls. This wasn't war anymore. This was survival gone wrong. That night, Harrow couldn't sleep. The others joked, smoked, and passed a bottle around the campfire. But his mind was back in the shack, replaying the look in Elsa's eyes, the kind of look that haunted you, trust and terror tangled together. He walked over quietly. The women slept in the officers' quarters under guard. But when he stepped inside, Elsa was awake, sitting near the window, watching snow fall through the cracks. You should rest, he said softly. I can't. Her voice was barely a whisper. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the bombing again. The screaming. I think maybe it's still happening somewhere. He hesitated, then sat across from her. The silence between them stretched thin and fragile like glass. You don't have to be afraid anymore, he said. It's over. She looked at him then, really looked. Is it for you, maybe? But for us, what are we now? Prisoners? Or ghosts? Harrow didn't know how to answer. He wanted to say she was free. But freedom was a word that had lost meaning somewhere between the front lines and the frozen roads. In the morning, orders came through. The captives were to be taken to Division HQ for debriefing. Harrow volunteered to escort them. Maybe he wanted to make sure they weren't mistreated. Maybe he just wanted to believe some part of mercy still existed in this world. As the trucks rumbled away from the compound, He stood at the back again, snow in his hair, rifle against his chest. Elsa sat beside him, wrapped in an army blanket, watching the horizon. "Where will they take us?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere safe," he said, though the words felt hollow. She nodded, but her eyes stayed distant as if she already knew safety was a lie. The landscape rolled by. Ruined villages, burnt trees, endless gray. Between them, silence grew heavy, but it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was something deeper. Two survivors of the same storm, waiting to see if humanity could still be found beneath the rubble. When the truck stopped for the night, the air was colder than ever. The sky burned orange behind the wreckage of the mountains. Elsa's hands trembled as she climbed down, and without thinking, Harrow reached out to steady her. For a second, their eyes met. Not as captor and captive, but as man and woman. Two souls left behind by a war that had taken everything else. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was look at her and realize, with quiet horror and reluctant awe, that something inside him had changed. He had spent years learning to kill the enemy. Now, faced with one who no longer had the strength to stand, he could only feel one thing: compassion, and it scared him more than any battlefield ever had. More than any battlefield ever had. The convoy reached division headquarters by dusk the next day. It wasn't a building so much as a scar. An old manor turned command post, surrounded by fences and floodlights. The flag of the Republic hung limp in the snowstorm, its colors dull under gray skies. Harrow jumped from the truck as the engines died. The cold hit harder here, sharper, like the air itself hadn't forgiven anyone for surviving. Officers barked orders, guards unloaded supplies, medics hurried between tents. It should have looked like victory. Instead, it looked like exhaustion pretending to stand upright. "Prisoners go to Holding C," a lieutenant called out. "Separate the wounded from the others." "Debrief starts at dawn." Elsa flinched at the word prisoners. Harrow saw it, that faint tightening in her jaw, the way her fingers clutched the blanket tighter. She had done nothing but survive, yet the world refused to call her anything else. He stepped closer. "It's just procedure," he said quietly. "They'll ask questions, make sure you're not a threat?" She finished, her voice flat. "After what you saw in that camp?" He didn't answer. She turned away before he could try. The women were led to the old stables that had been turned into temporary barracks. Inside, the smell of hay fought with diesel and damp wood. Beds were nothing more than cots lined against the wall, a single lantern burning low. Elsa sat on the edge of one, her eyes empty. Harrow lingered at the doorway until the guard shot him a look. "You can go, Corporal. They're not your problem anymore." He hesitated. "Maybe not. But they're someone's problem." The guard shrugged. "Command doesn't care what happens to Axis nurses. They're lucky they're getting a bed at all." That night, Harrow found himself wandering the corridors of the manor. The halls smelled of paper and gun oil. Typewriters clattered behind doors where officers wrote reports about battles no one wanted to remember. He passed a window and stopped. Outside, the snow fell thick and soundless, covering the footprints of men who had done terrible things in the name of duty. He wondered when duty stopped being a shield and started being an excuse. Morning came with the sound of boots and orders. The interrogation rooms were small, bare, and cold enough to see your breath. Harrow wasn't supposed to be there, but his unit commander allowed him to observe, claiming it would be good for morale. He wasn't sure whose. Elsa sat on the other side of the table, hands folded in her lap. Her face was pale but calm. The officer questioning her, Major Kellis, had a voice like gravel and eyes that saw only paperwork. "Name?" "Elsa Weber." "Rank?" "Medical assistant." "Affiliation?" "Northern Axis Army," Kelly scribbled notes. "So you admit service under enemy command." "I tended the wounded," she said. "I didn't fight." "Everyone serves in their own way," he muttered without looking up. "What happened at Camp Virel?" She hesitated, eyes flicking to Harrow for half a heartbeat. Then softly, "We were abandoned. Locked in, the rations stopped. We thought the war would come back for us, but it didn't." Kellis leaned back. "And you expect us to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," she said, the first hint of steel in her voice. "But that's what happened." Something in the room shifted. The major stared at her a moment longer, then snapped his folder shut. "That'll be all." As the guards let her out, she passed Harrow and whispered, barely audible, Why do they ask if they've already decided? He didn't know. He wanted to say that truth mattered, but in war's aftermath, truth was just another casualty. Later that evening, Harrow found himself outside again, leaning against a jeep, watching the horizon blur into snow. Sergeant Briggs approached, lighting a cigarette. "You're spending a lot of time thinking, Corporal." "Dangerous habit." "Just trying to understand, sir." "Understand what?" "What comes after all this?" Harrow said. "We won. But it doesn't feel like winning." Briggs exhaled smoke, the ember glowing in the cold. "That's because you're looking for something clean. There's no clean in war, just survival and what you tell yourself afterward." He tossed the cigarette into the snow and walked off, leaving Harrow with nothing but the wind and the hollow ache of truth. 2 nights later, a commotion broke out in the barracks. One of the guards had struck a prisoner, not Elsa, but one of the other women. Harrow was nearby when it happened. He heard the cry, the shouted order, the crack of a rifle butt against wood. He stormed inside. The guard was standing over the girl, shouting something about Axis rats. Harrow didn't think. He grabbed the man's arm, yanked him back, and shoved him against the wall. "What the hell are you doing?" Harrow hissed. She mouthed off. "They're lucky we don't—" "Enough!" Harrow barked. The room went silent. The guard's eyes flicked to his stripes, saw he outranked him, and backed down with a muttered curse. When Harrow turned around, Elsa was standing there. She hadn't moved to help, hadn't even breathed loud enough to notice, but her eyes were wide. Not with fear, with something like disbelief. Later, when things had calmed, she approached him outside the stable. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." She looked at him for a long moment, her lips trembling just slightly. "No one has done anything for us in a very long time." He wanted to say something kind, but words failed. Instead, he pulled off his gloves and handed them to her. "Keep them. It's colder at night." She looked down at the gloves, then at him. "Why are you kind to me?" Harrow hesitated. The snow crunched underfoot, the silence of the camp stretching around them. Finally he said, "Because someone has to be." The days blurred after that. The women were processed, questioned again, assigned numbers and papers. War turned people into files faster than it turned them into corpses. Harrow helped when he could. An extra ration here, a blanket there. It wasn't heroism. It was humanity trying to crawl back from extinction. Elsa spoke little, but when she did, her voice carried that strange calmness of someone who had seen the world's worst and still refused to surrender to it. Once, as they stood near the truck yard, she asked, "When you go home, will you tell them about us?" "I don't know," Harrow said. "They don't want to hear about prisoners. They want parades and stories about bravery, and you?" He looked out at the gray distance. "I want silence. Maybe a life that doesn't smell like smoke." For the first time, she smiled. Small, sad, real. That night, the sky cleared. The stars were sharp and bright, scattered like shards of glass over the black horizon. Harrow walked to the edge of camp, where the world dropped into a frozen valley. He heard footsteps behind him and turned. Elsa stood there, wrapped in her blanket, his gloves still on her hands. "They said they'll move us soon," she said. "To a different camp. Further east," he nodded slowly. "That's good. Maybe it'll be better there." "Do you believe that?" He wanted to, but belief was a fragile thing after everything he'd seen. She stepped closer, her voice low. "I used to think all soldiers were monsters. That you came only to destroy? Then you gave me water." He looked at her, the cold burning his lungs, the silence heavy between them. "Maybe we all become monsters if no one stops us," he said. "Maybe mercy's the only thing that keeps us human." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out, hesitating, and touched his sleeve. Just once. Enough to say thank you without words. When she walked away, Harrow stayed, staring at the empty road that led east. He didn't know what waited there, for her or for him, only that something inside him had shifted again. The war had ended, but the battle for what was left of their souls had only just begun. Snow fell again the morning they came for her. The trucks idled in the courtyard, engines humming like restless beasts. The prisoners stood in a line, hands clasped in front of them, blankets tight around their shoulders. Their eyes were dull, resigned. They'd stopped asking where they were being taken days ago. Questions no longer mattered when every answer led to another cage. Harrow watched from the steps of the barracks, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. The frost bit through his uniform, but he didn't move. He was waiting, though for what he wasn't sure. Orders had come down from Division Command at dawn. All Axis detainees to be transferred east for reallocation. The word meant nothing, but it sounded clean enough to hide what it truly was. When Elsa stepped out of the barracks, the world seemed to pause. She looked smaller than he remembered, swallowed by the heavy gray coat someone had given her. Her hair was clean now, braided loosely, her face pale but calm. She didn't look defeated, just tired in a way that went deeper than the skin. She carried herself like someone who had already said goodbye to too many things. Their eyes met across the yard. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. A sergeant barked orders. The women began to move toward the trucks. Harrow dropped his cigarette, grinding it into the snow. Something in him refused to let the moment end like that. He walked down the steps, boots crunching, heart pounding. He didn't care about the looks from the other soldiers. "Elsa," he called. She turned, startled, as he caught up to her. He started, but the words tangled. "I just wanted to make sure you're alive," she finished, a faint ghost of humor in her tone. "I've managed so far." He almost smiled, but it faded quickly. "Where are they taking you?" She shook her head. "They didn't say. Somewhere with food, they promised." Then softer. "They've promised many things before." He looked around, guards watching, officers shouting, the machinery of victory grinding forward. "I'll find out. I'll make sure you're treated right." Her eyes held his, steady and searching. "You can't protect me forever, James." Hearing his name from her lips did something to him. Broke something open inside that he didn't know he'd been holding together. He wanted to tell her that he would try anyway, that he'd follow her to the ends of the frozen earth if that's what it took. But soldiers didn't make promises they couldn't keep, so instead he just nodded once. "Be careful out there." For the first time she smiled, and small and real. "You too," then she was gone. The trucks rumbled to life, coughing black smoke into the pale morning, and one by one they rolled out of the yard. Harrow stood there long after the last tire track was covered by snow, until the world went silent again, and only the ghosts of their footsteps remained. Days passed. The camp felt emptier, colder. The war was officially over. The Republic Army pulling back toward home, but victory felt hollow. Men talked about going home to wives and farms and cities that didn't exist anymore. Harrow tried to imagine his own return, to streets that smelled of rain instead of smoke, to quiet mornings without gunfire. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elsa in that truck, vanishing into the white horizon. He started asking questions, quietly at first. Where had the transfers gone? What happened to reallocated detainees? The answers came back vague, rehearsed. Somewhere east. Reconstruction zone. Not your concern. But Harrow couldn't let it go. One night he found himself in the records room lit only by a single desk lamp. The air smelled of dust and ink. Stacks of folders towered like gravestones. He searched through the lists, scanning names, numbers, destinations. When he finally found the convoy report, his stomach turned to ice. Convoy 47B, Eastern Labor Zone. Estimated survival rate, classified. He stared at the words for a long time. Survival rate, not condition, not treatment. Just a percentage of lives expected to keep breathing. And the column next to Elsa's name was blank. He closed the file slowly, the paper trembling in his hands. By morning, he had made his decision. He forged his own travel pass using an old requisition form, scrawled a signature that looked close enough to Kellis's, and requisitioned a jeep under the pretense of supply transport. No one stopped him. No one cared enough to ask why a tired corporal was heading east into the snow. The road was nearly buried. He drove for hours through silence so deep it felt sacred. The radio crackled occasionally with distant reports. Peace treaties, reconstruction, troop withdrawals. Words that sounded like another world. The land here was dead. Villages burned to their bones. Fields frozen. Rivers turned to gray veins under the ice. By nightfall, he reached the checkpoint listed on the report. It wasn't a camp so much as a scar on the land. A cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by wire. guarded by a handful of men who looked more like ghosts than soldiers. "Supply delivery," Harrow said. Flashing the papers, the guard barely looked at them. "Drop it by the main tent." He did, then slipped away toward the barracks when no one was watching. The stench hit him first. Sweat, sickness, hopelessness. Inside, rows of faces turned toward him. Women, children, old men. Starved, broken, barely human. For a second, the world tilted, and he thought he'd stumbled back into the first camp. But then a voice, weak and shaking, called his name. "Harrow!" He turned. Elsa was there. She was thinner, paler, but alive. She stood leaning against a post, her hair cut short, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she laughed. A sound that broke halfway through and turned into a sob. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither. Should you?" He crossed the space between them and caught her as she nearly collapsed. Her body was cold, fragile under his hands, but she clung to him like someone waking from a nightmare that had gone on too long. "They said we were being moved to rebuild," she murmured. "But it's just another prison. Work until we vanish." "Not anymore," he said, voice rough. "You're leaving now." She shook her head weakly. "You'll be court-martialed. Then I'll stand trial knowing I did one thing right." They left at dawn. Harrow stole a supply truck and loaded it with what food and blankets he could find. The guards didn't notice until they were already halfway down the frozen road. When gunfire finally echoed behind them, it was distant, muffled by the storm. Elsa sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket, silent. Her eyes were closed, her face turned toward the weak light of morning. For the first time in weeks, she looked almost peaceful. "Where will we go?" she asked softly. He gripped the wheel tighter. "North, there's still villages there. People trying to start over. Maybe they won't ask too many questions. And after that?" He glanced at her. "After that? We keep driving until the world forgets about the war." A small smile touched her lips. "Do you really think it ever will?" He didn't answer, but somewhere inside he hoped. They drove for hours. The snow thinned. The mountains gave way to hills, and the gray sky lightened just enough to show the promise of dawn. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, alive. For the first time, there was something like hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. Eventually, the truck sputtered and died, the last of the fuel gone. They walked the rest of the way, across a valley littered with frost and sunlight. Harrow carried the rifle slung low, more for memory than for need. Elsa leaned on him, each step slow but steady. At the ridge, they stopped. Below, the land opened wide, untouched, endless. A river wound through it like silver thread, and smoke rose faintly from a distant farmhouse. Life, small but stubborn, was beginning again. Elsa looked at it and whispered, "It's beautiful." Harrow nodded. "It's real." She turned to him then, her eyes wet but shining. "You saved me," he shook his head. "You saved me first. You reminded me what it means to be human." For a long moment they just stood there. Two souls the war had failed to destroy, breathing the cold, clean air of something like freedom. The wind picked up, carrying away the sound of gunfire, the cries, the endless orders. All that was left was the quiet, and in that quiet, for the first time, peace didn't feel like surrender. It felt like mercy. It felt like mercy.